The morning after her wedding, the house filled with screams. They said Sarah Lowell was dead, pale, cold, and still in her bridal gown. But when they laid her in the coffin, her eyes were open. And when the lid closed, some swore they heard her whisper, "I'm not done yet." It was June of 1865, in the quiet riverside town of Milford, Massachusetts. The war had just ended, and the air was thick with relief, and something else. A strange, heavy stillness that seemed to settle over the Lowell estate as preparations for the wedding began. Sarah Lowell, only 19, was to marry Thomas Wren, a veteran returned from the war with one arm and too many ghosts. Their union was meant to symbolize rebirth, hope, and the town's slow healing. The whole of Milford gathered that day beneath an open sky, the scent of lilacs drifting on the wind. Sarah descended the staircase in a gown of white lace that shimmered like frost. Her veil trailed behind her, brushing the wooden floor like the whisper of wings. But there was a strange look in her eyes, something distant, as if she were walking towards something unseen. The ceremony passed without flaw, though a few noticed how Thomas trembled when he placed the ring upon her finger. Afterward, the couple rode to Milford House, a grand but aging mansion Sarah's father had given them as a wedding gift. Its walls were lined with portraits of the Lowell family, stern-faced and watchful. That night, candles flickered through the high windows. Music drifted faintly from the parlor. The servants whispered that the bride and groom had retired early, and the house went still. But just after midnight, a scream tore through the hallways. When the servants rushed upstairs, they found Thomas Wren standing beside the bed, his face white with horror. Sarah lay motionless across the sheets, her skin cold as marble, her wedding gown still immaculate. Her eyes were open, fixed upon the ceiling, and her lips were parted as though she had been about to speak. The doctor arrived within the hour. He pronounced her dead from sudden heart failure, likely brought on by shock or exhaustion. But the maid, Ruth, who had helped dress her that evening, refused to accept it. "She was breathing," Ruth whispered. "I saw her chest rise." The doctor dismissed her. The family made arrangements. The coffin was ordered by morning. Yet as the undertaker closed the lid, every man in the room fell silent. For just before the nails struck wood, a faint sound came from within. A heartbeat, or something that wanted to be one. If you were Thomas that night, would you have opened the coffin, or walked away forever? The town of Ashmere had never seen such a wedding. On June 14, 1865, the Lowell estate glowed under a sky that could not decide between light and shadow. The Civil War had just ended, yet grief still hung in every heart. People came in muted colors, not celebration, but survival. And there, at the center of it all, stood Sarah Lowell, pale, deliberate, watching every movement as if through glass. Her gown shimmered like frost, stitched by hands that trembled under candlelight. The veil was thin, nearly transparent, allowing her expression to flicker between joy and something else, something unreadable. The groom, Jonathan Harker, a respected lawyer from Richmond, stood tall and confident, though witnesses whispered later that his eyes darted too often toward the door. The ceremony was held in the drawing room, not the church. Sarah had insisted on that. She claimed the church bells still rang with sorrow, a phrase that made little sense at the time. The Reverend hesitated but complied. The Lowells were generous benefactors. When the vows were spoken, a sudden gust swept through the open windows, extinguishing half the candles. A few guests gasped. One claimed to smell iron in the air like rust or blood, but Sarah did not flinch. She simply said, "I do," with such finality that even the Reverend's voice faltered. Afterward, the guests dined in silence. The string quartet played too softly to drown out the scraping of cutlery. Sarah barely ate. She kept glancing at her mother, who stared back with a look of exhausted terror. Jonathan, though polite, avoided her gaze. By nightfall, the guests departed. The house emptied into a silence thick as fog. Sarah and Jonathan climbed the wide staircase to their new chambers. The servants exchanged uneasy glances, whispering that the air had turned cold enough to see their breath. Hours later, someone heard a sound, a thud, followed by a faint, strangled gasp. Then nothing. The candles in the hallway flickered out one by one, as though snuffed by invisible fingers. At dawn, the chamber door remained closed. No one dared knock. That evening, when Jonathan finally emerged, he looked 10 years older. He said nothing. He left the house and never came back. And Sarah Lowell, the bride, was found lying motionless in her bed, her eyes open, her skin cold, her pulse still faintly there. If you lived in Ashmere, would you believe she had truly died? Or would you have waited to see if she moved again? The doctor from Ashmere arrived before dawn. His name was Dr. Elias Morton, a man too rational for superstition, too weary for miracles. Yet even he hesitated at the threshold of Sarah Lowell's room. The air inside was thick, unmoving. Every candle burned slower, as though the flame itself resisted the task. Sarah lay upon the wedding bed, still in her gown. The lace around her wrists had darkened with moisture, though no one knew from where. Her eyes were half open, not in terror, but in a strange, distant focus, as though watching something beyond the room. Dr. Morton leaned close, pressing his ear to her chest. No heartbeat, no breath. Yet when he withdrew his hand from her wrist, he noticed something that would haunt him for years. Her skin was not cold. It was warm, faintly, persistently warm. He ordered the windows opened, but the servants refused. "The birds do not sing outside," one whispered. And indeed, when Morton listened, the world beyond was unnaturally silent. No morning crows, no crickets, only wind. Her mother, Mrs. Lowell, sat rigid in a chair by the bedside. "She's not gone," she said. "You'll see. She promised me she wouldn't go." Morton dismissed it as grief. Still, when he tried to close Sarah's eyes, the lids resisted, stiff as though bound by unseen threads. He applied pressure again. They fluttered once faintly, and then stayed open. He backed away. "We must prepare her," he murmured to the servants, "before decay begins." But no decay came. Hours turned to days. The body remained untouched by time. Her lips retained color. Her hands stayed supple. By the third day, rumors began to move through Ashmere. Whispers that Sarah Lowell's soul had refused to leave her body. Some claimed she'd made a pact. Others said her heart had stopped between two worlds and could not find either. Jonathan Harker, her husband, was nowhere to be found. The Lowell family offered no explanation, only silence and closed shutters. On the fifth day, something changed. A maid swore she heard faint movement in the room, fabric brushing against wood as though Sarah had turned her head. Morton was summoned again. He entered the chamber alone. For an hour, nothing. Then, from behind the closed door, a sound echoed. Soft, deliberate breathing. When the doctor emerged, his face was as white as her gown. "She should be dead," he said quietly. "But she isn't. Tell me in the comments, what do you believe happened that night? Was it love that held her, or something darker that refused to let her go?" Jonathan Harker had been the pride of Ashmere, a man of promise, charm, and quiet intelligence. When he vanished on the night of his wedding, the town was left paralyzed between suspicion and fear. Some whispered that he'd fled out of guilt. Others claimed he'd gone mad. But there were a few, only a few, who believed he never left at all. The sheriff, Elias Wren, began his search at the Lowell estate. The trail was faint but strange, a man's boots leading from the garden to the rear barn, and then nothing. The prints ended abruptly, as if swallowed by the earth itself. Inside the barn, the scent of roses lingered unnaturally strong, the same flowers Sarah had carried during the ceremony. Wren noticed something else, a patch of dirt darker than the rest, still damp despite the dry weather. When he touched it, the earth clung to his fingers with the consistency of blood. By morning, the rumor had hardened into legend. "The bride took him," townsfolk muttered in corners. She rose and took what belonged to her. Mrs. Lowell, pale and sleepless, refused to entertain questions. She locked Sarah's chamber, claiming it was for her peace. But at night, those living nearest the estate heard soft movements, a dragging step, a muffled sob, sometimes the faint hum of a wedding hymn drifting from the upper window. Dr. Morton returned, demanding to see the body again. Mrs. Lowell resisted, but grief had stripped her strength. When the door finally opened, both recoiled. The bed was empty. The sheets, cold and damp, smelled faintly of iron and lavender. A trail of footprints, bare, small, unmistakably human, led from the bed toward the door and stopped there. Morton ran to the servants, to the cellar, to the fields. No Sarah, no Jonathan. Only that lingering scent of roses and something else beneath it. Decay. When the sheriff arrived later that night, he brought 2 men with shovels. They dug around the barn until the moon sank. What they uncovered chilled them all, fragments of a wedding veil buried shallowly in the soil, torn and stiff with something that was not mud. "Do you still believe she died?" Wren asked the doctor. Morton said nothing, and as the wind picked up, one of the servants swore she saw a woman in white walking beyond the orchard, holding something heavy in her arms. "Would you have followed her into the dark?" The orchard behind the Lowell estate had always been a quiet place, rows of pear trees standing like mourners, their branches sagging under the weight of forgotten fruit. But after that night, no one dared go near. The servants whispered of seeing a woman there, pale as fog, wandering between the trees long after midnight. Dr. Morton returned once more, unable to let the matter rest. He brought a lantern, its weak light trembling against the black bark. The air smelled of overripe pears and something fouler beneath, the sharp metallic sting of rot. Each step crunched through fallen fruit, soft and wet like flesh. Halfway down the path, the lantern flickered. Morton froze. Ahead, through the pale mist, he saw movement, slow, deliberate, like fabric brushing against bark. He called out softly, "Mrs. Lowell?" No answer, only the faint creak of branches shifting above. Then she appeared. The figure stood between the trees, her gown soaked to the hem, lace torn and darkened. Her face was pale, almost luminous, and her eyes, wide, unblinking, reflected the lantern's light like glass. She carried something close to her chest, wrapped in her veil. Morton stepped closer, trembling. "Sarah." The woman tilted her head slightly as though hearing her name from a faraway place. The bundle in her arms moved. He could hear it, a faint, muffled sound, neither cry nor breath, but something between. Morton's voice cracked. "What have you done?" She turned toward him fully then, and in the shifting light he saw that the veil was not white anymore. It was red. Beneath it, a man's hand, a small, pale, limp, hung from the folds of the fabric. Morton stumbled back, his lantern swinging wildly, casting monstrous shadows through the trees. When he looked again, she was gone. The orchard was empty. Only the faint trail of footprints remained, leading back toward the house. But they did not end there. They circled the home again and again, like something restless, trapped, unable to enter. By dawn, Morton was found wandering the fields, incoherent. He spoke only one phrase: "She's waiting for him to wake." The sheriff sealed off the orchard. The townsfolk prayed in whispers, and yet those who lived nearby swore that every night, just before dawn, the scent of roses would drift through their windows, followed by the sound of two sets of footsteps, walking side by side. Would you have dared to follow that scent, knowing what waited at the end of it? 3 weeks after Sarah Lowell's burial, if it could truly be called that, the orchard began to sink. The ground, once solid and dry, turned soft, as though something beneath the soil shifted restlessly. Rain had not fallen in days, yet the earth bled water, dark and cold. A farmhand named Thomas Vale was the first to notice. While trimming branches near the eastern edge of the orchard, his foot caught on something hard, metal, glinting faintly beneath the mud. He knelt and brushed it clean. It was a ring, gold, delicate, still warm to the touch. Inside the band was an inscription, J.H. to S.L., until death and after. Thomas froze. He knew what it meant. Every person in Ashmere had attended that wedding, had seen the same ring placed upon Sarah's trembling hand. But how had it come to rest here, deep beneath the trees where no grave lay marked? He brought it to the sheriff. Wren turned the ring over slowly in his palm, his jaw tightening. "We buried her with this," he said. I watched it. Dr. Morton, summoned again, examined the find with a grim fascination. "If the ring was unearthed," he murmured, "then so was she." The sheriff and 2 men took lanterns and spades to the orchard that night. They dug near the spot where the ring was found, the air heavy with the smell of wet decay. The soil was dense, resisting them as though it clung to what it hid. At last they struck wood, a small box, unmarked, old but sealed tightly shut. When they pried it open, a wave of cold air escaped, so sharp it extinguished one of the lanterns. Inside lay the remnants of fabric, lace, and something else, a finger, pale, preserved, and unmistakably human. The sheriff stumbled back, his face drained of color. Morton leaned closer, his voice shaking. "It's her. It's the same finger that wore this ring." They buried the box again before dawn. The next morning, every pear on the eastern trees had fallen, rotted overnight, their skins blackened as though burned from within. The townsfolk took it as a warning. None returned to the orchard. But at night, under the cold Missouri moon, those who passed the road claimed they saw her, a woman in white, standing among the twisted trees, one hand bare, the other shining faintly gold in the dark. Tell me in the comments, what would you have done with that ring? Kept it, or buried it deeper? Mrs. Lowell had not left her room in nearly a month. The house, once bright with the chatter of servants and the scent of lilies, had grown silent. Curtains were drawn tight, mirrors covered with cloth. Candles burned even through daylight, leaving streaks of smoke on the ceiling above her prayer chair. She sat by the window every night, facing the orchard. Sometimes she would whisper her daughter's name, not in grief but in conversation, as though Sarah stood just beyond the glass. "You'll catch cold out there," she'd murmur softly, her eyes fixed on the mist rolling between the trees. Servants whispered that the widow had gone mad. But one maid, Anna, claimed to have seen something that changed her mind. "She isn't speaking to herself," Anna whispered. "She's speaking to someone who listens." The first night Anna stayed awake, she crept quietly to the widow's door. At first all she heard was murmuring, Mrs. Lowell's tired, trembling voice. But then, beneath it, a second tone, low, hollow, as though the reply came not from a living throat, but from somewhere deeper. Anna fled the house before dawn and never returned. Dr. Morton came again, under the pretense of checking the widow's health. When he asked about Sarah, Mrs. Lowell's eyes softened strangely. "She's safe now," she said. "I hear her at night. She tells me she's not alone anymore." Morton felt the familiar chill return. "You believe she's with her husband?" "She says he's learning to speak again." The doctor excused himself quickly. On his way out, he noticed something that made his stomach turn. Footprints near the window, pressed deep into the earth below. They were small, bare, and led toward the orchard. Next to them, another set followed, larger, male. That night, a storm broke over Ashmere, tearing branches and flooding fields. But in the Lowell home, no lights flickered. The widow kept her vigil as always, whispering to the night beyond the glass. By morning, the servants found her chair empty. The window was open, curtains fluttering in the wet breeze. On the windowsill, two things remained: a candle still burning, and the sound of soft humming fading into the distance, the same wedding hymn Sarah had sung as she walked down the aisle. When the storm cleared, the orchard shone under the sun, clean and glistening. But on the ground, beneath the largest tree, two sets of footprints led into the mist, and none came back out. If you lived in that house, would you have stayed, or run before nightfall? A month after Mrs. Lowell's disappearance, a rider came through Ashmere from the neighboring town of Craven's Hollow. His horse was exhausted, his face gray with dust and fear. He told the sheriff that a man had been found wandering the forest 2 miles south of the Lowell estate, barefoot, disoriented, and covered in scratches, as if he'd clawed his way out of the ground. When they brought him in, the sheriff froze. It was Jonathan Harker. He was barely recognizable. His once dark hair had turned streaked with white, his lips cracked and bloodless. When asked where he'd been, he stared through the men as if they weren't there. "She found me," he whispered. "She wouldn't let me go." Dr. Morton examined him in silence. There were marks on Jonathan's wrists, small, perfect impressions, as if fingers had clutched him for too long. Beneath his shirt, along the ribs, faint bruises formed a strange, symmetrical pattern, circular, almost floral, like the outline of a wreath pressed into the skin. "Where is she?" Morton asked gently. Jonathan's eyes flickered toward the window. "She's here," he said. "She never left." They kept him at the infirmary under watch, but every night he grew more restless. He spoke of hearing her voice through the walls, calling him softly by name, promising that they were still wed, that death was a ceremony unfinished. On the third night, a nurse found him standing at the window, humming that same wedding hymn. His hand bled where he'd been scraping the glass. When she tried to stop him, he turned with a strange calm and said, "You can't keep a promise like ours buried forever." The next morning, Jonathan was gone. The window was shattered from the inside, shards of glass scattered across the floor like frozen tears. The tracks outside led straight toward the orchard, bare feet pressed into mud, each step accompanied by a smaller, lighter print beside it. By evening, the sheriff gathered a search party. They found the footprints leading to the same tree where the ring had been unearthed. The soil there was freshly disturbed. When they dug, they found nothing but 2 sets of imprints pressed deep into the clay, side by side, as if 2 bodies had once lain there and then stood up again. That night, the town bells rang without cause. No one claimed to pull the rope. Would you have believed he came back of his own will, or that something called him home? The bells of Ashmere were old, cast in 1812, hung above the chapel that overlooked the town square. For 50 years, they had rung only for births, weddings, and burials. But on that windless autumn night, they began to toll on their own. The sound started low, almost hesitant, as if testing the air. Then came another, a second, deeper tone trembling through the streets like a heartbeat beneath the ground. Doors opened. Candles flared. The townsfolk gathered in the square, eyes lifted toward the chapel tower, where the bell ropes swayed though no hands touched them. Sheriff Wren arrived with his lantern raised. "Who's up there?" he shouted. No answer. Only the steady rhythm of the bells, tolling 12 times at midnight, then continuing, ignoring the hour, each strike echoing through the fog like a call that would not be silenced. Dr. Morton arrived minutes later, breathless. "It's them," he said quietly. "It's the vow." Together they climbed the chapel steps. The air grew colder with every turn, thick with dust and something older, the smell of damp stone and burnt oil. The ropes swung freely, their frayed ends snapping against the walls. Yet the bells above moved in perfect sequence, as if guided by invisible hands. Then the noise stopped. Silence pressed down like a weight. Morton held his breath. A faint sound came from behind them. Not movement, but whispering. 2 voices. Male and female, soft, familiar. Wren turned, lantern raised. The flame flickered wildly, revealing faint impressions in the dust. Footprints, 2 sets, one smaller, one larger, leading toward the chapel door. And just before the flame sputtered out, both men saw it. A white veil caught on a beam, fluttering though no wind blew. When they descended, the square was empty. The townsfolk had fled indoors, shuttering their windows. In the stillness that followed, Morton thought he heard faint laughter. Not cruel, but sorrowful, as though someone mourned a love that had lasted too long. The next morning, the veil was gone. The ropes lay still, but carved into the chapel's wooden door were 2 initials, SL and JH, intertwined, freshly cut, the wood still bleeding sap. That day, no one entered the chapel again. If you lived in Ashmere then, if you heard those bells calling in the night, would you have gone to see who was answering them? By the week's end, the town of Ashmere lived in a hush. Doors locked before dusk, candles burned through the night. Even children stopped singing in the streets. The tolling of the bells had ended, yet something heavier lingered, a silence that seemed to wait for its own echo. Sheriff Wren could not rest. He returned to the chapel alone one afternoon, determined to put an end to the rumors. Dr. Morton followed reluctantly, still haunted by what they had seen. Together they entered the nave, the air thick with mildew and old wax. Morton's eyes drifted to the altar. A draft blew across the floor, and the candle flames bent in unison, all pointing toward a seam in the stone beneath the pulpit. Wren knelt and brushed away the dust, revealing the faint outline of a trapdoor. The hinges were old, sealed by time, but with effort they pried it open. The smell that rose was not the scent of rot. It was colder, older, like the air from a sealed tomb. A narrow stair descended into darkness. Wren lowered his lantern first, its trembling glow illuminating stone walls carved with faint, uneven crosses. They followed the passage down until it widened into a crypt. There, lined in 2 rows, were old coffins, 10 at least, names long faded by damp and age. But one coffin stood apart, newer, untouched by dust. Morton approached it slowly, fingers trembling. The brass plate read, Sarah Lowell Harker, 1843-1865. Wren swallowed. "She was never brought here," he whispered. "Her family buried her on their land." Morton said nothing. He lifted the lid. Inside lay a gown, the same gown she had worn on her wedding day. But where the body should have been, there was only soil, fresh, black, and damp, as though taken from the orchard that very morning. Atop the soil lay something small and pale, a single tooth. Morton reached for it, then stopped. The air shifted, and a faint sound rippled through the crypt. A sigh, a woman's breath, slow and close. The lantern flame dimmed. From the far end of the chamber came the faint creak of another coffin lid rising. Then another, Wren shouted, stumbling back toward the stairs. But as they climbed, the bells above began to toll again. Slow, deliberate, and perfectly timed to the rhythm of footsteps rising from the crypt below. If you had stood in that chapel hearing those steps climb after you, would you have dared to look back? 2 days after the bells rang again, a group of church cleaners refused to return to the chapel. They claimed they'd found footprints on the pulpit floor, small, bare, and wet, as if someone had walked straight up from the crypt below. The sheriff ordered the doors barred, but by then the whispers had already spread through town. It was Dr. Morton who returned first, driven by the one thing stronger than fear, the need to understand. He searched the rectory adjoining the chapel, hoping to find the chapel's old burial records. Instead, in a locked drawer beneath the pastor's desk, he discovered something else. A bundle of yellowed letters tied with black ribbon. The handwriting was unmistakable. Sarah Lowell. The first letter was dated 1 week before the wedding. "Jonathan dreams of me dying," she had written. "He says I rise from the bed and call him to follow. But when he does, I vanish. He wakes in tears and I can't tell him why it feels like a promise." The second was worse. "Mother says the orchard soil is sacred, that no body buried there ever decays. She tells me not to fear the grave, for love does not end with breath." Morton read through trembling hands. The letters hinted at a ritual, something older than Christian marriage, older than the town itself. A binding of souls, not till death do us part, but through death we remain. The final letter, stained and smudged, was written the night before the wedding. He asked if I would follow him anywhere. I said yes, he asked, even into the earth. I said yes. He smiled and said he would make sure we never part. Morton dropped the pages, his heart pounding. The air in the rectory thickened, carrying the faint scent of pears and roses, the same scent that always heralded her presence. He turned toward the window. In the glass, for just an instant, 2 reflections stood where one should have been, his own, and behind him, a woman in white. When he spun around, the room was empty. Only the letters lay scattered across the desk, though one had moved. A fresh line, in ink that glistened wet. "You found us. Now we'll find you." By the time Morton fled the rectory, the chapel bells began to sway once more, not ringing this time, but groaning under the weight of unseen hands. Tell me in the comments, do you believe some vows are strong enough to outlive the body? By late November, the Lowell house stood half abandoned. Ivy clawed across the brick and rainwater crept beneath the windowsills. But one room remained strangely preserved, the front parlor, where the great gilt mirror still hung above the fireplace. The servants refused to clean it, claiming the glass no longer showed what was in front of it, but what waited behind. Dr. Morton, desperate for answers, returned again. He found the house silent, its walls swollen with damp. His footsteps echoed as he entered the parlor. The air was unnaturally still. No sound of wind, no ticking of clocks. Only the faint scent of roses lingering like a memory. He approached the mirror cautiously. It was veiled in a white sheet, untouched since Sarah's death. When he lifted the cloth, dust cascaded to the floor like ash. The glass beneath was flawless, too flawless. It did not reflect his face, nor the room behind him. Instead, it shimmered faintly, as though water rippled across its surface. Then the reflection began to move. The parlor in the glass was not his own. The candles there burned brighter, steadier, casting long shadows of 2 figures, a man and a woman. They stood close, facing one another, hands entwined. Morton's heart froze. It was Jonathan and Sarah. Her gown gleamed white, untouched by decay. His face, pale and sorrowful, turned slightly toward the viewer, toward him. Morton stepped back. "You're gone," he whispered. "Both of you." But Sarah's lips moved. He couldn't hear the words, only the rhythm of them. Soft, slow, like the echo of vows spoken long ago. The man beside her raised his hand, placing something against the inside of the glass. A ring, golden and glinting. Morton's own reflection vanished completely. Only theirs remained. And then, a second later, something began to tap from the inside. Steady, deliberate, like fingernails against wood. He stumbled backward, the sheet still clutched in his hand as a crack spread across the surface of the mirror. From the fissure, a drop of dark fluid leaked. Not water, not ink, but blood. It slid slowly down the frame, staining the white lace cloth beneath. Morton fled the house in silence. By dawn, the servants found the parlor empty. The mirror hung shattered, its pieces scattered across the floor like frozen tears. But in every shard, one image remained the same, a woman in white standing behind him, her eyes open, waiting. Would you have dared to lift that sheet, knowing what might be staring back? On the morning of December 3rd, 1862, the townspeople of Bedford awoke to the tolling of the church bell. Not for mass, but for warning. The night before, someone had seen a man walking the northern road, barefoot in the snow, his clothes soaked through, his eyes hollow. When they called to him, he did not answer. When they followed, his footprints ended at the Lowell property gate. But none came out the other side. Jonathan Lowell had been buried 8 months earlier. By noon, half the town had gathered along the old fence. The gate was ajar. Dr. Morton arrived with Sheriff Hall, his face pale, his hands trembling from a night without rest. They entered the grounds together, finding the air heavy with the scent of wet earth and burnt candles. The front door stood open. Inside, the corridor was lined with mud-stained prints, bare, long, uneven, as though made by someone uncertain of his own balance. The prints led toward the parlor, where the shattered mirror still hung. Morton froze when he saw what lay before it. A coat. Jonathan's coat, torn, stiff with frost. Beneath it, a man's outline in the dust, as though someone had lain there for hours. But the strangest part wasn't what they found. It was what was missing. The wedding ring, the same one Sarah had worn, and was gone from its locked case. Morton whispered, "He came back for her." Sheriff Hall scoffed. "You mean a thief, maybe a vagrant. Ghosts don't leave footprints." But that night, every dog in Bedford howled until dawn. The next morning, Morton returned once more, unable to stop himself. He found the parlor colder than before. The mirror fragments still reflected that same pale figure of a woman, now with her head slightly turned as though listening. He spoke aloud, "Jonathan, if you found her, let her rest." The candles flickered, though no window was open. The air thickened, pressing down on him. Then, faintly, he heard a voice, low, rough, almost human, whisper his name. He turned. No one stood behind him. When Morton left, the snow had already begun to fall again. He walked the long path back to town, unaware of the faint second set of footprints following his own, pressed lightly into the white, as though made by someone walking just out of sight. Someone who no longer belonged to the world of the living. And from the house, through the broken glass, came a whisper soft enough to be mistaken for wind. "Till death do us part." By the winter of 1863, the Lowell house had become what the people of Bedford called the Hollow. No one lived there, yet no one dared tear it down. Farmers avoided the northern road at night, and even travelers passing through town crossed themselves when the crooked silhouette of its roof appeared against the moonlight. The snow never seemed to melt there. It crusted over the porch, the windows, the steps, white and heavy, as though the land itself refused to breathe. Children said they could see a woman's hand pressed against the upstairs window at dusk, pale as bone, unmoving for hours before fading into the dark. One night, a man named Thomas Briggs, a war veteran turned drunk, decided to test the town's superstition. "Ghosts," he said in the tavern. "Don't scare men who've seen the real thing. I'll sleep there tonight." "You'll see." No one stopped him. By sunrise, they found him in the road, his eyes open, his face blue. His boots were missing, his feet torn and black from frost. He had walked barefoot through the snow from the Lowell house to the edge of town. In his hand, he clutched a small, rusted locket, one that hadn't been seen since the night Sarah Lowell was buried. Inside was a miniature portrait, Sarah in her wedding gown, smiling faintly. Yet behind her shoulder, almost imperceptible, a shadowed outline, broad, masculine, indistinct, loomed. Dr. Morton examined the body and swore that Briggs died not of cold, but of sheer fright. His heart had simply stopped. The coroner's report noted, no sign of struggle, no visible wound, only a line of faint bruises around the man's wrist, as if something unseen had tried to pull him back. After that, no one went near the house. Morton, however, could not let it go. He began documenting every strange occurrence. Flickering lights in the attic, unexplained footprints, and the faint tolling of a bell that no longer hung in the chapel. He started calling it the hollow phenomenon, the way the air grew thin near the house, as if the world itself refused to fill the space. He once wrote in his journal, It is as though the walls remember. As though love, once denied peace, keeps circling the threshold, waiting for a door that never opens. And from that night forward, Bedford stopped calling it the Lowell home. They called it the Hollow House, not because it was empty, but because everything within had already been claimed by something that refused to leave. Dr. Morton had tried to forget the locket, but the image of the faint figure standing behind Sarah Lowell haunted him. The shadow had shape, yes, the broadness of a man's shoulders, the slight curve of a hand resting near her veil, but no face. Only emptiness where a face should have been. He retrieved the original wedding portrait from the county archive, stored among yellowed church records. The clerk hesitated before unlocking the cabinet, warning him that it had been donated under strange circumstances. The photographer who captured the image died just a week after the ceremony. Some say he burned his negatives, the man whispered. Others say he saw something he wasn't meant to. The portrait was fragile, edges brittle, colors faded to sepia ghosts. Yet when Morton held it under the lamplight, he saw it again. Sarah's soft, almost reluctant smile, and behind her, that same hazy outline, more distinct now, as if it had grown clearer with time. He studied it for hours, comparing it to known figures of the era, her husband, her brother, even the minister who wed them. None matched. The stance, the angle of the head, the subtle tension in the hands, they all felt foreign, as though belonging to someone who didn't belong in that place or time. Morton began to dream of the figure. In his dreams, he was the one behind Sarah, standing just close enough to feel the chill that radiated from her skin, the perfume of lilac and damp lace surrounding her like a veil. He would reach for her shoulder, only for her to turn her head, and the eyes that met his were not human. They were open, bright, and empty as glass. One night he woke with dirt under his fingernails and the scent of wood smoke in his clothes. He had no memory of leaving his home, yet muddy footprints trailed from his door all the way to the street, leading north toward the Hollow House. He burned the portrait that morning, but as the flame consumed the paper, he swore he heard a voice, faint, feminine, whispering from within the smoke, "Not yet." That same afternoon, the townsfolk found scorch marks on the door of the Hollow House, as if lightning had struck only that one spot. The rest of the structure remained untouched. And above the doorway, etched in black ash, a new shape had appeared, the faint outline of a man's hand, reaching outward, as though pressing from within. By early spring of 1864, the Hollow House stood in eerie silence once again, yet the townspeople whispered that something had woken after the burning of the photograph. Travelers reported a low sound, rhythmic and hollow, echoing through the ground beneath their boots when they passed by. It was not the wind nor the shifting of timbers, but something like a heartbeat deep beneath the floorboards. When Dr. Morton heard the stories, he convinced himself that it must be a trick of vibration, perhaps the water table beneath the house, or the settling of the foundation. Still, he could not resist the pull of curiosity. He gathered lanterns, his journal, and a shovel, and by moonlight entered through the back door that hung by one rusted hinge. The air inside was thicker than before, heavy, metallic, as though years of damp rot had fermented into something unnatural. His lamp threw trembling shadows across the walls. The wallpaper peeled in strips, and a faint scent of lilac still lingered, impossible and wrong after all these years. The sound came again, faint at first, then distinct. Thud, thud, thud. It seemed to rise from the parlor floor, slow and patient, like something remembering the rhythm of life. Morton knelt, pressed his ear to the wood, and froze. The beats were too regular, too deliberate. It wasn't random noise. It was measured, heartbeats. He pried up a loose plank and lowered the lantern. Beneath the boards, the soil was damp and dark. He dug with trembling hands until his shovel struck something hard. Not wood, not stone, but bone. He brushed away the earth to reveal a ribcage, still clothed in the remnants of tattered lace. A wedding dress. Morton fell back, his breath caught between terror and awe. The corpse beneath the house was unmistakably that of Sarah Lowell. And yet her burial had been witnessed, her coffin sealed in the town cemetery a decade earlier. He stumbled backward, barely able to stand. The heartbeat had stopped. But as he turned to flee, a faint creak sounded behind him, a step on the old staircase, slow and deliberate. Morton raised his lantern toward the sound. The flame flickered, throwing long shadows. At the top of the stairs stood a woman in a ruined bridal gown, her veil clinging to her face, her eyes glinting like two pale marbles in the dark. Her lips parted, cracked, bloodless, and she whispered his name. "Doctor." Dr. Morton froze where he stood, the lantern trembling in his grip. The woman on the stairs was no apparition of vapor or dream. She was solid, her gown heavy with soil, the lace stiff with old decay. When she moved, the fabric made a faint cracking sound, as though the fibers themselves resisted being disturbed after so many years beneath the earth. Sarah? The name escaped him before he could think. She tilted her head, and the motion was unsettlingly slow, mechanical, almost studied, like something learning how to mimic life. Her eyes reflected the light of the lantern, flat and pale, and in that unblinking stare, Morton understood that whatever stood before him wore the bride's shape but not her soul. He stumbled backward, his heel striking the loose floorboards he had torn up moments before. The heartbeat beneath them started again, faster now, echoing through the floor, through his legs, into his chest. It wasn't his own pulse, it was hers. "Sarah," he whispered again, as if the name itself could tether her to memory. She descended one step. The air turned cold enough that his breath appeared in clouds. Another step. The boards groaned as if under the weight of something heavier than flesh. "Why?" she murmured, the voice dry as wind over a crypt. "Why did they put me there?" Morton's lantern guttered, flame shivering on the verge of death. "You were buried." "In the cemetery," he said, barely able to form the words. Her face twitched, and then something like laughter, though strangled, wrong, scraping through her throat as though she hadn't used it in years. "No," she said. "He wouldn't let me go." She stepped into the full light, revealing the rusted chain coiled around her wrists and the remnants of a wedding ring fused into her bone. Dried blood, or what remained of it, streaked the gown like faded rust. Morton realized then what she was, a woman buried not in sanctified ground, but sealed beneath her own home, entombed by the man who had sworn to love her. He took a single step forward. "Sarah, please!" Her eyes snapped to his, and the heartbeat stopped. In the silence that followed, the walls of the hollow house began to creak and moan, the sound of timbers shifting as though the structure itself was awakening from sleep. Then, faintly, from the dark above them, the sound of wedding bells. Not ringing in celebration, but tolling, one by one, for the dead. When dawn broke over Bedford, Dr. Morton stumbled out of the hollow house, covered in dust and trembling, as if the night had bitten through his sanity. He told no one what he had seen, not yet. But in his pocket he carried something he hadn't meant to take, a small iron key wrapped in a strip of rotted lace. By afternoon he returned to the town's record office, demanding every document concerning Jonathan Lowell, Sarah's husband, the man everyone had quietly pitied after her sudden death in 1855. The clerk hesitated but eventually brought out the marriage license, property deeds, and a single folded letter sealed in black wax. The letter bore no sender's name, only 3 words, "For the truth." Morton broke the seal. Inside were lines written in Jonathan's hand, uneven, desperate, and trembling. She would not die. 3 nights, and still she breathed. I prayed, I begged, I waited. But she opened her eyes again, and I knew it was not her. God forgive me. I locked her below so she could not walk again among the living. Morton read the words again and again until the ink seemed to move beneath his eyes. Sarah Lowell had not died on her wedding night. She had awakened after. The physician who had declared her dead, Dr. Callahan, had since moved to Kansas. But his journal, stored among the estate files, contained an entry dated the day after her supposed burial. Patient expired under unusual paralysis. No decay, no rigidity. Eyes responsive to light even post-mortem. I fear premature burial, yet her husband insists on immediate internment. Morton's pulse quickened. It was all there. The pattern, the rush, the lie. Jonathan Lowell hadn't lost his wife. He had entombed her alive beneath their home, sealing her with iron nails and prayer. That night, Morton returned to the hollow house to confirm it. The ground still bore his footprints, the open boards still gaped like a wound. But now, there was something else. A line of words carved into the wall with something sharp and deliberate. He buried me, but I remember. The writing was fresh. He turned toward the stairs where she had stood the night before. The air heavy, still, suffocating. On the lowest step lay a single white flower, brittle with age yet impossibly intact, a bridal lily. And beneath it, etched faintly into the wood, "The groom is not done." Morton's hand shook as he picked it up. The heartbeat had stopped, but the house was waiting. Dr. Morton could not sleep that night. The phrase carved into the wood, "The groom is not done," repeated in his head like a curse. He felt watched in his own home, his windows seeming to breathe, his lamps burning lower without reason. Every sound in the walls, every faint creak of timber, made him imagine the dragging of lace and chain. At dawn, he packed his lantern, the iron key, and a Bible. He told himself he was returning to the Hollow House not as a doctor, but as a man trying to right a crime. The floor where Sarah's remains lay was disturbed again. The loose boards had shifted, and a faint outline, something like the shape of a coffin lid, was now visible in the soil. Morton knelt, brushing away the dust with trembling hands. The key fit a rusted lock embedded in the wood. When he turned it, the latch gave with a shrill metallic cry. Inside was not a coffin, but a box, narrow, long, lined with faded velvet. And within it lay bones that were not hers. These were smaller, thinner, the remains of a man. The jawbone still held a single gold tooth. Jonathan Lowell. A rotted scrap of parchment was clutched in the skeleton's hand. Morton uncurled the brittle fingers and read what remained. "She came to me again. Said she forgave me. Said she'd only rest if I joined her. So I built her another chamber, beneath the first. I thought I would find peace there. But her heart still beats." Morton's stomach turned. He looked beneath the velvet lining, and there, beneath the corpse of the groom, was another layer of wood, freshly disturbed earth beneath it, as though something had clawed from below. The faint heartbeat began again. Slow, heavy, it pulsed through the floor, through the air, through him. Thud, thud, thud. Morton's lantern shook violently, the flame bursting higher as if reacting to the rhythm. He stepped back, covering his ears, but the sound grew louder, no longer from beneath but behind him. He turned. Sarah Lowell stood inches away, veil torn, her skin the color of ash. Her lips parted as she raised her chained hands, pointing not at him, but at the open box where her husband lay. Then she spoke softly, almost kindly. "Help me bury him again." And before Morton could move, the soil beneath the floor began to shift on its own. The lantern flame wavered, its light trembling across the dirt as the ground beneath Dr. Morton began to breathe. The soil lifted, fell, and shifted, not with the slow creep of settling earth, but with deliberate rhythm, as though something alive beneath was turning in its sleep. Morton staggered back, his boots sinking slightly into the soft ground. The air was thick and damp, heavy with the smell of rust, mold, and something far sweeter, the cloying scent of lilacs. It came from everywhere, as though the flowers were buried deep within the walls, their perfume leaking through like trapped breath. Sarah Lowell stood motionless before him. Her veil swayed, though there was no wind. "He wouldn't stay where I left him," she whispered, her voice cracked, faintly echoing from behind the cloth. "He keeps rising when the bells call." "The bells?" Morton asked, but the word died in his throat. From outside, faint through the trees, came the sound of distant chimes, the church bell of Bedford. But it wasn't Sunday, and it wasn't morning. Each toll rang slower than the last, as though the bell itself had to fight through air thick with age. Sarah's eyes lifted toward the sound. For the first time, Morton saw something in them beyond emptiness, a memory of pain. "He used them to wake me," she murmured. "Now they wake him." The soil stirred violently. A pale hand, skeletal and dirt-streaked, thrust upward through the ground at the foot of the box. Morton stumbled backward, nearly dropping the lantern. Another hand followed, and then the faint clatter of bone against wood. The remains of Jonathan Lowell, thought to be rotted and still, began to move, twisting within the confines of the coffin. Sarah stepped closer. Her chain dragged behind her like a whisper. "You see?" she said softly. "He never let me rest." Morton fell to his knees, half in disbelief, half in terror. The man's skull tilted upward, jaw opening and closing in a grotesque pantomime of breath. From within, a wet sound escaped, a wordless gasp that might once have been her name. "Sarah!" Her expression did not change. She looked down at him with a calm that was worse than rage, worse than grief. "Now you understand," she said. "There can be no peace while love remembers. The heartbeat resumed, one rhythm shared by both corpses. And as the bells of Bedford fell silent again, the soil closed over Jonathan Lowell's hand, pulling it slowly back down into the dark. Only the faint impression of a gold ring remained upon the earth, pulsing faintly, as if it still felt the warmth of the living. That night the church bells did not stop. Their tolls rolled across the valley like thunder that refused to fade. People woke from their beds thinking the hour late or the town under warning, but when they checked the steeple, the ropes hung still. The bell was tolling by itself. Those who dared to go near the church swore they saw shapes in the belfry, a man and a woman swaying together in slow rhythm, as though caught in an invisible dance. No one recognized their faces, yet every witness agreed. The bride wore white, and the groom's collar gleamed like tarnished gold. By morning, frost covered every window in Bedford, though the season had not yet turned. In the frost, words formed, faint, crooked but readable. He woke her. Dr. Morton locked himself inside his home, sealing every door and covering every mirror. He no longer trusted reflections. In the glass, he sometimes caught glimpses of her standing behind him, veil fluttering, eyes blank and patient. He could no longer tell if she was haunting him or merely waiting for him to act. The bells tolled again at noon. He clutched his chest. He could feel it now. A dull, synchronized pulse deep in his ribs, matching the slow rhythm from beneath the hollow house. Each strike of the bell made it stronger. He opened his journal and began to write feverishly. It is not the dead who haunt the living. It is the bond between them. She wakes because he remembers her. He rises because she cannot forgive. The bells are the heartbeat of their covenant, each toll a breath shared between them. But even as he wrote, the air in his study grew cold. The ink in his pen thickened, turning to a dark, sticky sludge. He looked down and realized it wasn't ink at all. It was blood. The letters smeared across the page, still spelling the same words over and over. He woke her. He woke her. He woke her. Outside, the bells rang one final time, a note long and trembling, shaking the very glass in his windows. Then silence, and in that silence he heard it clearly. A woman's soft laughter drifting through the streets. It was the sound of a bride remembering joy, and twisting it into something unholy. Morton knew then that the bells weren't warning Bedford, they were calling him. Weeks passed, but Dr. Morton could not escape the Hollow House's presence. Every street corner, every alley in Bedford carried the faint scent of lilacs, sweet, cloying, and impossibly out of season. It was as though Sarah Lowell herself had stretched the garden beyond the grave, sending the fragrance to follow him, to mark him. One evening, he returned to the town square to consult old records, only to find the flowers growing in unnatural clusters between the cobblestones. Where he stepped, petals withered instantly, leaving dark stains that smelled faintly of damp soil and decay. He realized the bloom was not life but memory, and that memory was contagious. At the Hollow House, the air had grown thick with frost, the windows frozen over like eyes in a skull. Morton entered, lantern raised, hands shaking. Every step echoed on the wooden boards as he ascended to the parlor. Dust hung in columns through the lamplight, and somewhere in the shadows, something moved, just beyond sight. On the floor lay the bridal veil, long lost from Sarah's crypt. It stretched unnaturally, covering the boards where Jonathan's coffin had rested. Morton bent to lift it, and immediately felt it pull against his hands, as though weighed down by more than cloth. Underneath, the faint imprint of her body pressed the floor like a ghostly stencil. As he examined it, he noticed something odd. Tiny lilac petals interwoven into the lace. Fresh, vibrant. Despite the house's decay, the fragrance was overpowering, intoxicating. It swirled around him, teasing his memory with the days he had spent documenting her tragedy, each letter, each photograph, each heartbeat beneath the floor. Then the whisper came, soft as the flutter of petals. "Jonathan is awake." Morton froze. The sound came not from the parlor, but from beneath the floorboards. The soil shifted again. The heartbeat returned, faint at first, then louder, thudding in perfect rhythm with the tolling bells of Bedford, now just audible through the frozen air. The veil trembled, petals lifted as if caught in a breeze. And for the first time, Morton understood the purpose of the flowers. They were markers, a map tracing where Sarah had been buried, where she now walked, where Jonathan slept, waiting for her to find him. He stepped back, realizing the inevitable. The veil had chosen him. And as the house exhaled cold air that smelled of lilacs and rot, he knew the next step would bind him to their story, whether he survived or became part of it forever. Would you have lifted that veil, knowing it might call her to you? The hollow house was silent for 3 nights. Dr. Morton dared not enter, but he could hear the faintest tremors through the frozen floorboards, a creak here, a groan there. The town of Bedford slept uneasily, the scent of lilacs creeping into homes, curling in corners, settling on pillows. On the 4th night, a storm blew in from the north. Snow fell in thick, blinding sheets, and the wind carried a low moan that sounded almost human. Morton, unable to resist, wrapped himself in his coat and braved the tempest to reach the house. Lantern in hand, he stepped through the frost-laced doorway into the parlor. The floor was broken in places, the boards lifted and shifted. Beneath, the heartbeat had returned, strong, deliberate, almost jubilant. Morton knelt, placing his ear near the trembling boards. It was no longer Sarah's alone. Jonathan's pulse had joined it. The rhythm was uneven at first, then synchronized. 2 hearts beating in the same cadence, one buried and one alive only in memory. Morton lit the lantern brighter, revealing the open trap beneath the floorboards. There, in the shallow soil, Jonathan's skeleton had risen partially, as if straining to breathe after decades of forced slumber. The chains that had once bound Sarah now lay around his wrists, twisted remnants of the vows they had once spoken. The air thickened with lilac fragrance curling around the rising figure. Jonathan's jaw moved, cracking as if the years of burial had stiffened the bones, yet his eyes glimmered with a spark of awareness, a grotesque semblance of life. Then the veil of white appeared, drifting across the floor. Sarah moved with a precision that seemed almost preternatural, her eyes fixed on the awakening form of her husband. She leaned down, brushing his shoulder with the lace of her gown, whispering words lost to the storm, yet clearly a command. Morton realized with mounting horror that she was not merely haunting, she was controlling. The heartbeat beneath the floor, the shifting soil, the frost, the lilacs, all were instruments in a ritual older than the town itself. The storm outside intensified. The wind shrieked through broken windows like the wail of the dead. From beneath, Jonathan's pulse quickened. He rose fully from the shallow grave, limbs awkward, bones creaking, yet undeniably present. Sarah stepped closer, her veil brushing against his chest. The heartbeat, now joined, resonated through Morton's entire body. He could feel it in his bones, in his veins, in his mind. And then she whispered clearly, audibly, "Now!" "We are complete." Morton staggered back, realizing that the hollow house would never release them, nor him, while the vows they had bound in life remained unbroken. Would you have watched, knowing that the living and the dead had fused into one unstoppable force? Dr. Morton stumbled backward, his lantern shaking in his hands as the bride and groom faced one another atop the fractured floorboards. The storm outside raged, yet inside, an unnatural calm spread. A silence so thick that it seemed to absorb every sound except the joined heartbeat beneath the hollow house. Sarah stepped toward Jonathan, her movements deliberate, almost ceremonial. Each step seemed to mark the rhythm of something ancient, older than the town, older than the church. She lifted her hands, brushing the chains that bound his wrists, whispering vows no living soul could comprehend. Morton's breath caught. He realized what had been happening all these years. Sarah had awakened, yes, but not to escape. She had awakened to complete a ritual, a covenant of life and death, a bond stronger than decay, stronger than the grave. The vows they had spoken on their wedding night had been incomplete. Death had interrupted them, but now death itself was irrelevant. Jonathan stirred, his skeletal jaw moving in response to her words. A faint glow emanated from his chest, where the heart should have been. The heartbeat now pulsed audibly, not only through the house but seemingly through the ground outside. The lilacs that grew impossibly in winter quivered as though alive, their petals trembling in rhythm with the pulse of something unnatural. Morton realized that the hollow house itself was a participant. The timbers groaned in cadence with the heartbeat. The boards beneath their feet shifted, lifting slightly as if the house exhaled, drawing life from the ritual. The wedding rings, fused into bone and chain, gleamed faintly, reflecting lantern light like twin eyes watching him. Sarah leaned close to Jonathan, pressing her forehead to his. The glow intensified. Morton felt his own heartbeat falter. This was no longer a haunting. It was a resurrection, a dark echo of life interrupted, a covenant completed not through the love of the living, but through the will of the dead. The chains fell away, sliding across the floor like liquid metal. Jonathan stood fully, solid and terrifying, yet his eyes were hollow, reflecting the cold brilliance of a bride who had no intention of leaving him behind. Morton fell to his knees, powerless, as Sarah lifted her arms and spoke, her voice a melody of lilac and decay. Together, always, until no one remembers, and even then we will endure. The ground beneath them pulsed one final time, and Morton felt the earth itself shudder. Outside, Bedford seemed to hold its breath. The storm ceased. The bells fell silent. And yet the heartbeat continued. Would you have interfered, or simply watched, knowing that some vows are eternal, binding the living, the dead, and the soil beneath them into a covenant no one can escape? The hollow house stood in absolute stillness. Snow lay undisturbed, but the scent of lilacs lingered like a whisper of a memory that refused to die. Dr. Morton sat on the frost-stiffened porch, lantern by his side, realizing the truth he had been running from. Some stories do not end. Some marriages, some bonds, persist beyond death, beyond reason, beyond time itself. Inside, the heartbeat no longer echoed only through the floor. It filled the air, the walls, the very ground, pulsing as though the hollow house had become a single entity, one life composed of two deaths and one eternal promise. Sarah and Jonathan Lowell moved silently through the house, their forms unchanging, their eyes unyielding, their presence a reminder of vows that had been interrupted only by human fear. Morton rose, knowing he could never leave. Every step away from the house felt like betrayal. Every glance over his shoulder reminded him of the ghosts who had claimed it, not out of malice, but out of necessity. The bride and groom were not malevolent. They were inevitable. They were the completion of an unfinished covenant, a bond that refused dissolution. Outside, the town remained unaware of the events unfolding on the northern road. Bedford slept, oblivious to the hollow house's eternal inhabitants. And yet, those who ventured too close would sense the heartbeat, faint but insistent, pulling them toward the house, toward the inevitability that had claimed Dr. Morton. Morton opened his journal one last time and wrote in the margins, hands trembling, some things cannot be buried. Some vows cannot be undone. She awakens, he rises, and the earth itself remembers. Forever bound. Do not seek them. Do not question them. To enter is to join the covenant, willingly or not. He placed the journal on the floorboards near the parlor window, where it would wait for the next curious soul. Outside, the wind carried the faint sound of a bell, distant but unceasing. Lilac petals, impossible in December, swirled around the house, brushing the walls, the windows, the footprints that led to the front gate. Inside, Sarah and Jonathan stood together, their hands entwined. No words were spoken, yet everything necessary had been said. Their ritual was complete. They existed now between life and death, a single pulse of inevitability, moving through the hollow house and into eternity. Dr. Morton's lantern flickered one final time. The light caught the gilded mirror in the parlor, unbroken now, reflecting only him. And then, as the heartbeat pulsed beneath the floorboards one last time, he realized he was no longer alone. The hollow house had claimed him. Outside, the town of Bedford slept on, unaware that in the north, just beyond the bend in the road, a bride and groom had learned the terrible, unyielding truth of forever. Would you have stayed or run, knowing that some promises endure beyond death, unbroken and eternal?